Hi everyone. I'm just waiting for the live to set in full, and then we will begin this morning's lesson. All right, today's lesson, this afternoon's lesson, whatever time that you may be zoomed in and listening. All right, so we are here to speak about nutrient flow and energy flow in the ecosystem. So we are in section A of the HSB syllabus, and that's our lesson for today. So allow me to share the screen as we go through. So once you go to your classroom, you will find a listing of your relevant notes that will go along with this session, as well as the worksheet that is made for this section. I will send everything to your WhatsApp group, so you could just click a link and go directly to the notes. All right. So today's note is found, two notes, there's two documents. It is found between in the section of section A notes, and you will look for um, when you go to section A notes, under section A, you will look for the pyramid of numbers and biomass along with nutrient and energy flow. All right, so that's our lessons for today. All right, so we start off with nutrients and energy flow. So we did Grimna, and we said, let me just zoom in a bit. All right, so feel free to pause the video at any time to take any notes, as well as you can go to the actual notes as well. You can print them and have them as well. So do anything that works well for you, but ensure that next week you have this note in your book and you have understanding. Any questions you may have, you can leave it down below in the comments on YouTube, as well as um, you can also send me a direct message, or you can keep it for next class. Anything will work. All right. So we started off speaking about cells. We did transporting cells. There's a topic before this one, which is photosynthesis. I prefer to do that at our class session. So we are jumping ahead, but it's not going to limit us from understanding today's lesson. All right. So we are expected to know about how nutrients flow and energy flow in the ecosystem. All right. And we said in Gribner, characteristics of living things. In order for us to be living, we must have nutrition, all right? And we're going to look at that today from this level in terms of the feeding relationships as well as the energy flow in the ecosystem. So we said that the ecosystem is all the living and the non-living components, so living things, animals, plants, bacteria, all of those things, and how they interact with the environment, right? So the sun, the water availability, all of those non-living components, where do they live, and all of that. So that's the ecosystem, right? So this topic we are speaking about how they feed, how feeding works in the ecosystem, and how energy flows. All right. So first of all, we will note that the sun is our primary source of energy. All right. As we look at the sun and how the sun gives energy, that's where we get our energy from. But how do we move from the sun having energy to us receiving energy as humans? All right. The plant is one of the most important, I would say, organisms in the ecosystem. The plant is actually the organism that receives the energy from the sun and produce food or sugars that we can partake in, which gives us a flow of that energy received. All right. So plants, because they produce food, we call them producers. They produce sugars and other molecules that we use in our everyday life. All right. So plants produce their own food, right? They produce food for themselves and for us. All right. So we call them producers. Anytime you hear producers, think plants, but plants are not the only producers. In some cases, some rare cases, there are some bacteria, all right, that are actually producers. They don't use photosynthesis or energy from the sun. They use chemicals to be able to produce energy, but we're not going to touch on that today. So our main producer for today are plants, right? And these producers are also called autotrophs. Now, the word auto means self. For example, automatic door at the mall that opens for itself, the word auto means self. All right. So autotrophs actually means self-feeders. All right? Of course, I'm spelling self incorrectly. Okay. So self-feeders. So autotrophs are self-feeders. All right. So these autotrophs, they again, as I said, they feed themselves. So the plants feed themselves. The word trophs actually means feed or to feed or feeding level. All right. So autotroph means self-feeders. So plants are self-feeders. They produce their own food and they feed themselves. So they are supposed to define autotrophs in the examination. You see autotrophs are self-feeders. For example, plants use photosynthesis to produce food which they use for their own development. All right. Now, plants, though they are producers, the other organisms don't produce, they are consumers. So, what is a consumer? Take the definitions. These are some simple definition questions that they could bring for you in the exam. Okay? So, plants are um, producers, and other animals are consumers. All right? So, other animals feed on plants and they feed on animals to obtain their food. All right? So, you could either be a plant feeder, animal feeder, or a both feeder, but you are a consumer. So, humans are consumers, right? We don't make our own food, we consume. All right. So basically, there is a way in which we feed, or a routine by which we feed, or there are some specific organisms that we feed on. There's ways in which this feeding process takes place. So a food chain is one of the ways to show how feeding relationships exist between plants and animals in the ecosystem. So a food chain is a diagram that shows energy flow and nutrient flow from the producer all the way up to the consumers. All right, so that's a food chain. All right, and next thing to note about food chain is that a food chain shows a single feeding relationship. I'm going to discuss it. A single cycle of a feeding relationship. All right. So the food chain starts off with the producer. Please do not put the sun in the food chain. That's wrong. All right. So the food chain, right, it basically shows us how nutrients flow in the ecosystem. So the plant produces its own food via photosynthesis, and we said that they feed themselves with some of the nutrients that they will produce. And then the grasshopper will feed on the grass, right? The frog will feed on the grasshopper. The snake will feed on the frog, and the hawk will feed on the snake. And that's a single feeding relationship. So they can ask you in the exam to draw a food chain. Please look at the direction of the arrow. All right. So the arrow does not go from what is feeding on, like the feeder, to what is feeding on. People asked me before. People even drew it before and asked me why the arrow is not that way. Isn't it that way they are feeding? No. Please note, and this is later on in the note as well, that the arrow shows energy flow. All right. So the arrow shows how the energy be a G, right? The arrow shows how the energy flow as well as the nutrients flow, right? So it shows energy flow and nutrient flow. All right. That's what the arrow does. It shows the energy flow and the nutrient flow in the ecosystem. Okay. So please remember not to draw your arrow the opposite way. Okay. So it goes from the producer and then to the consumers. Now we have different levels of consumers, just like how we have different levels of schools, right? So you first go to, well, you go to preschool, but we don't have pre here, right? You go to primary, secondary, you can also go to tertiary, right? So it's the same way, these feeding levels have similar names, right? So we have the primary consumer, we have the secondary consumer, we have the tertiary consumer, and then we have something called the quaternary consumer, right? As we go down in the notes, we're gonna see this further down, right? So these are all consumers. So what you should know at this point is that the food chain shows a single feeding relationship that exists between organisms in a food chain, within an ecosystem, right? So this is the food chain. But the reality is these organisms don't only feed on the organisms that are in this single food chain. All right, really and truly, our ecosystem is made up of a food web. Right? So just like a spider web has multiple connections, so is our food web. So the food web literally doesn't just show one feeding relationship. It shows multiple feeding relationships, and it also demonstrates the intermixing of your food chains. All right? So the food chains are intermixed. All right? The food chains are intermixed. All right? So the chains are intermixed and it forms a web. So basically, we are saying, yes, this frog feeds on a grasshopper, but it may also be feeding on some kind of fly, right? It may be also be feeding on some kind of fly or some kind of insect, right? And this grasshopper may eat grass, right? And it may have something else feeding on it as well, right? It may have some kind of bird that is feeding on the grasshopper. The snake may be eating the frog, but the snake may also be eating rabbits, etc., etc., right? So I want us to just know that though the food chain is good to show a single relationship, the web shows the grand scheme of things. All right, so take a note. What is the food web? A food web is an intermixing of food chains, all right, that shows the full flow of feeding in the ecosystem. All right, so take a note for that. So the food web is an intermixing of food chains that shows the full feeding relationships within an ecosystem. All right. You can pause, you can go back. That's the purpose of also of a pre-recorded session. You can just pull back a video a little bit and pause and take a note. All right. Good. So let's move forward. So let's talk about the names of the organisms at each feeding level. As I told you before, we said autotrophs mean feeding. The levels, we call them trophic levels, right? So we have the trophic levels. So the first level, as we mentioned before, are our producers. So they are always the first in the chain. Take a note of that. Producers are always the first in the chain. So they can ask you a question. Select the producer from this chain above. Remember, the producer is always first in the chain. All right. And then we have our producers. So they produce on land. We have producers, sorry, on land and also in water. Please learn some examples because they could ask you to draw a food chain from in a pond. And you can't tell them you don't know what's in a pond. So learn some examples of some pond food chains, some on land food chains, some ocean food chains. All right. So in case they bring something like that, you could fill it through. Right? And that's the difference between a person who gets a grade 1, a person who gets a grade 2, a person who gets a grade 3, and a person who doesn't pass. The one that will go the extra mile to ensure that they learn what they have to learn. All right. So the producers, they are the start of the chain, right? As I said before, there are some bacteria, such as the cyanobacteria that is found in desert areas where there is limited plants. They produce as well. All right. So an example of a producer would be like a grass, plants, berries. In the water, we have the algae, right? Is a type of seagrass. We have seaweed. These are all producers. But you never saw a tree in the sea. Guys are rhyming. You never saw a tree in the sea, right? So obviously, don't put you have to write an aquatic system. Don't put a tree and then a fish. You get it wrong, right? So no producers in the different areas. All right. Then we have the consumers. All right. So our consumers are called heterotrophs, right? So take a note. A consumer or a heterotroph is an organism that relies on other plants and other animals as their food source. They do not produce their own food. All right. So heterotrophs, the word hetero means different, as I told you before. So heterotrophs are different feeders. They feed on other organisms as their food source. All right. So consumers are your plants, right? So there are different types of consumers. There are three types you need to know. We have our herbivores, and they feed sorry on plants only. Let's think about Herb is grass, like, you know. So herbivores feed on plants only. Note that it may sound so simple, but as you will see the past papers, these type of questions come. Give me some herbivores, plants only. All right. And then we have our herbivores. So give some examples: grasshoppers, beetles, sheep, goat. I have a joke for you all. I have a cousin who gave the sheep chicken pilau, and the sheep ate the chicken pilau. So I don't know how much of a herbivore the sheep is, right? But based on theory, the sheep is a herbivore, right? And you know, for those that are in Tobago, in Scarborough, we have those sheep that actually eat the garbage by KFC. So I'm not too sure, but they are herbivores. All right. So typical herbivores are, like as I said, the grasshopper, the beetle, the sheep. There are some bears that are herbivores and some that are mixed, right? And these are typically the primary consumers. So most of the time, the herbivores are found right after the plants, obviously because they are eating the plants. All right, good. Then we have secondary consumers. So the primary consumers are your herbivores. The secondary consumers, right? They tend to feed on the primary consumer. So the secondary consumer tend to feed on the primary consumer as their nutrient source. All right. So the primary consumer is the one right after the producer, and then the secondary comes after the primary. All right. So the secondary consumer tends to be carnivores. What is a carnivore? A carnivore is an organism that feeds on animals only. All right. So the secondary consumer can be a carnivore. It can also be an omnivore, but we're going to get to that just now. But most times it can be a carnivore, right? And the carnivores feed on animals only. For example, lions, coyotes, foxes, wolves, some types of fish, hawk, eagle. They feed on um only animals. They are carnivores, right? Good. So they could ask you in the exam to look at the chain and pull out some carnivores. They could ask you to tell them which organism is a carnivore. They could ask you it in different ways, or they could ask you a food to draw a food chain, ensuring that you have a carnivore or something like that, right? So be open to anything. And the last one of the three consumers is the omnivore. So the omnivore, please pause and take your notes. The omnivore is organisms that feed on both plants and animals. All right. So the omnivore, they feed on both plants and they feed on animals. So the omnivore um, is like humans. Most of us are omnivores. We eat animals and we eat plants, right? Also, some bears are omnivores. As I said before, some are strictly um, carnivores and then some are omnivores, but they eat both, right? Then we have the squirrel. They tend to eat both. Some birds are omnivores as well. Humans are omnivores, but then there are some who decide to be herbivores, right? But we have teeth and dentition to be omnivores, right? So then this is how it goes, right? So after the primary, secondary, and tertiary, secondary, we have the tertiary consumers. And as it says, these tertiary consumers rely on the secondary consumers as their food source. All right. So the tertiary consumers rely on the secondary consumers as their source of food. All right. So please note that. All right. There's another level which is not listed here, but we saw it in the first food chain, and it's called the quaternary level, right? And the reason why we don't see it here, right? The reason why we don't see it there, the quaternary level, is because it's not typically seen on land, right? So the quaternary food chain is that level that they feed on the tertiary. right? So the quaternary level, they tend to feed on the tertiary, and I'm going to explain why we don't see it much, but still take a note of it. So the quaternary consumer feeds on the tertiary consumer. They feed on the tertiary consumer, right? So we pause and take that, right? But we don't, it's not typical. It is not typical for land food chains. I'm going to explain why. All right. So note that it's there, it's possible, but it's not typical. So if you go back to the first, if we go back to the first chain, we had the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So it's possible, but it's not typically seen. I'm going to explain to you why. All right. So for this, you can write down this food chain and you can put in the levels, right? So primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and yeah, don't have to draw people, so don't waste your time to be drawing diagrams. If you have time and you're spending a nice evening in HSB, then you can draw. But in a given exam, don't waste time to try to draw a frog. Just write the word frog. That's sufficient, right? Good. All right, good. So we mentioned before that the trophic level, right, is a place in which is the feeding level of each organism in the chain, right? So as I said before, food chains on land typically has 4 trophic levels. Please note, some students of mine in the past told me that they're not putting producers as a trophic level. It is a feeding level because they are self-feeders, right? So the first level will be the producers, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we tend to have 4 trophic levels on land and not 5, including the quaternary. And it is because energy tends to run out before you get to the quaternary consumer. We're going to explain that as we go along, right? So on land, we tend to have like about 4 trophic levels, but in the sea or the ocean, they can have more. They tend to have longer food chains. So note that they can actually compare trophic levels on land versus water. On land, they have more, while in the water, on land, sorry, they have less, while in the aquatic systems, in the water systems, they are more. All right. So these are our 4 typical levels that we have. All right. So we have the producer, the secondary consumer, the the primary, sorry, secondary and tertiary consumer. All right. And then at some point we also have decomposers, right? So the purpose of decomposers, though they may not be always a part of the actual chain, these decomposers are needed, right? Note that they could ask, what is the need of the decomposer to the food chain? So the decomposer literally is necessary for the food chain because the decomposer actually helps to break down, the decomposer helps to break down um, these organisms, right? So the decomposers help to, when they die, the decomposers help to break down and release the nutrients that is trapped in these consumers whenever they die, or these plants. So for example, a plant dies, the decomposer break it down, the nutrients that was in the plant is now released back into the ecosystem to be reused, right? The decomposers, this is not a mouse, this is a shrew, SHEW, and the shrew can die. And when the shrew dies, basically it breaks down and it releases um organisms, sorry, nutrients from the organism back into the ecosystem. So please note that the decomposers are releasers. All right, they release organisms back into the they release nutrients from the organisms back into the ecosystem. All right, so note that. All right, and then we have the chain, right? As I was mentioning to you before, trophic level 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, we're good. All right, so let's talk about energy flow in the food chain. All right, so we have this food chain, and it starts off with the grass. We have the shrew, we have the snake, and then we have this bird. All right, let me just clear the screen. We have this bird. So this bird is feeding on the snake, and the snake is feeding on the shrew, and the shrew is feeding on the grass. All right. Now, energy is flowing, as I said, from the grass onward. The energy is flowing from the producer to the consumers. They could ask you a question in the exam: which trophic level has the most energy? The grass, because it starts there, right? And then it goes on to the consumers. All right. So, as we said before, the energy that is seen in the producer is derived from the sun. So, the sun is the primary source of energy, right? And the plant will produce its own food by the process of photosynthesis. So, we'll go back there at our next session, right? So, it goes through the process of photosynthesis. And then the plant will use some of its own nutrients and the substances produced. So basically, the sun is in the form of light energy, right? And the plant receives this light energy, and the plant eventually creates a chemical energy product, right? If you do physics, you have a equation that says energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it goes from one form to the next, right? So the plant receives light energy from the sun and converts it to chemical energy, which is seen in the form of glucose and other sugars, right? Good. And other substances that are produced as a byproduct, right? So we go from light energy to chemical energy in the plant. Now, when the plant makes this glucose, the plant uses some of this glucose for respiration and other processes. All right. So the plant has to grow. The plant has to do transportation. The plant has to make other metabolic products, right? Such as vitamins and other things. So the plant will use up some of the energy it got. It doesn't just pass it along to the consumer. The plant has to do its processes. Please take note of some of the processes that the plant do, because guys, you have to be very specific in your answers. That's how you get that grade that you're looking for. All right. So the plant has to carry out that process: growth, repair, transportation, all of these things. The plant needs to reproduce, and all of these things. Energy is used in those processes. All right. So energy now received by the plant is now being transferred. But what I want you to also note, that though the sun is shining very hot, and the light energy is coming to the plant, only 2 to 5% of the light that the sun gives, the plant actually receives and absorbs, right? Out of whatever the plant will have received and convert to sugars, the plant only transfer. Please, this is 10% now. This 10%, we're talking about 10% right now. This 10% is the only amount that the plant could, after receiving energy, that the plant passes on to the primary consumer, right? So the plant only, so in this case, the plant only passes on 10% of the energy received to the shrew in this case, right? Only 10%, only 10%. So when the plant receives it, only passing on 10% of that energy. Now the shrew, again, is a living organism and has things to do, right? I think I just rhyme. The shrew have things to do, right? So the shrew receives the energy from the producer, and the shrew will consume it, and the shrew will do its bodily processes as well. So the shrew will grow, will move, will reproduce. The shrew would respire, carry out respiration to release energy. The shrew will also lose some energy due to heat, right, as well, right? By the time the snake eats the shrew, only 10% again. So this 10% number is a good number to remember. Only 10% It's passed on to the snake. Again, the snake has things to do. The snake has to move. The snake has to shed its skin. The snake has to grow. It has to carry out different processes. Again, only 10% is being handed on, all right, to the bird. All right, only 10%. So you see that 10%, 10%, 10%. By the time the energy meets to the bird, it isn't much. And as I told you before, we tend not to have another trophic level on land, because by the time you get to this level, how much percent you'll be able to have? Zero. Right? So that's why we have a limited amount. So they have to explain that, you have to explain this. Right? So energy is lost as it goes along the food chain. And if there was to be a fifth um trophic level, that organism may receive limited amount of energy. All right? Because of all the energy that was lost along the chain. All right. So I want us to note that. So energy starts very high at the producer, but it dwindles as it goes along. That's why these consumers have multiple food sources to meet their energy requirement. So the bird will eat the snake, you eat plenty snake, and the bird may also eat some rabbit. The bird might be eating something else, something else, something else, something else, right? Just to be able to get sufficient energy. All right. So please remember that 10%, 10%, 10%. And also remember some of the processes that the organisms will do by name. So tell them the organisms need to make new cells, they need to respire, all the things in Grimna. They need to move, they need to excrete. All of these processes will cause energy to be lost from each at each level. All right. And even some die, like plants lose leaves and all of that. All of that is energy being lost along the way. All right. So therefore, the consumers to the top of the food chain is getting the least amount of energy. Please underline that, because this is a typical question they could ask you. All right. Good. So that's why we rarely go beyond 4 trophic levels on land. I hope you understand. All right. So this is what we call a pyramid of energy. Now, the pyramid of energy is a diagram that just basically show what I just explained. The pyramid of energy shows the energy that is present along the food chain. So we have the producer with a lot of energy, then 10% is passed along, 10% is passed along, 10%. Now the food, the energy pyramid, sorry, typically we use simple numbers like these so that we could be able to show the 10%, 10%, 10%. Now, if they ask you to draw a pyramid of energy, please put in some numbers. The easy numbers to put in is like 10,000, 1,000, 110. You could actually easily remember those, right? And just remember, if you remember the 1,000, 10,000, then you remember, okay, 10% of 10,000 is 1,000, 10% of 1,000 is 100, 10% of 100 is 10. All right. Please note on the side as well that the unit for energy that we use in these cases, we use the joule. All right. That's the actual, the scientific is Joules. The joule is the scientific unit for energy. We also use calories. So you may see joule or kilojoule, right? So it's the same type of joule, but it's just our units, right? It's like we have meters and kilometers. And then we also see calories or cal and kilocal, right? Those are all units that we use, right? For energy. So please note those energy units, right? So these are the energy units, the joule and the kilojoule, right? You write joule, Joule, right? So we have the joule, the kilojoule, we have the cal and the kilocal, right? You will see them here. So this is what we call a pyramid of energy. Please draw this one. This one is a little more technical. So draw this one. All right. So write pyramid of energy and draw it. All right. So we see the producer having 10,000 joules, the primary consumer at 1,000 joules, the secondary 100, and then 10. All right. So this is the pyramid of energy. Sometimes you may see it drawn like a triangle. It's the same thing. All right. So you have the producer to the bottom. Then you have the primary consumer, secondary consumer, and then the tertiary consumer, right? So this is basically these same numbers at 100, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. All right. So these are the different levels. So please, next set, when you are asked to draw a pyramid, remember, label the trophic levels. Number one, put in the numbers and remember to have it in the structure that it is, right? So this is what we call the pyramid of energy. And I want you to note the pyramid of energy always have this form. It's always upright. It always has this form. We're going to see some inverted pyramids as we go along, right? So the numbers are always upright. All right? Hi, Sheila. I'm recording something. I'll call it back. I'll call it back. I'm recording something. All right, sorry about that. All right. So these pyramids, they are always upright. Right? They are always upright. Note that the energy pyramids are always upright. Okay? Good. So you have to understand how to draw a pyramid and explain it. So you tell them the plant is the producer, they are the bottom of the pyramid. And next thing, do not put the sun in the pyramid. Some people put the sun below here, so no, don't put the sun in the pyramid. The producer is the bottom of the base of the pyramid, right? Note that as well. Okay, good. So this is the pyramid. They could actually so when they ask you in the exam, with the aid of a diagram, explain the energy flow. They're asking you to draw the energy pyramid, a simple one. This is taking you 2 minutes to do the exam, and then explain what we just explained above, right? So the energy comes from the sun, the producer, the primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. They are all a part of the journey from the producer all the way up. Make sure you label it. In a case like where the pyramid has a peak and it can't fit it, don't try to striggle and write bird in the middle there. No, don't do that. Let's draw a little arrow going out and write it. Okay, make sure you draw it with a ruler. Neat. Neat, neat, neat. All right, good. All right. So this is your typical pyramid, and we mentioned this before. Ensure that you're putting your arrow to show the direction of the energy flow. All right, so we have the grass, the grasshopper, the mouse, the owl, and the arrows goes in the direction of how the energy is flowing. Okay? Okay. This is just what we just explained there. So there are two types of pyramids. There are two areas that we could find our chains and our webs, right? We have the terrestrial, which means on land, and the aquatic, which means in water, right? Now, this is a food chain on land. Okay, we have the grass, then we have the worm, we have the turtle, we have the eagle. Guys, practice to draw food chains because they could ask you to make up one, and they could just say, write a food chain including a cow. So then you will say, the cow eats the grass, and then the human eat the cow, right? So that's how we do it. Make it up, right? Don't say, I don't know, man. Make it up, right? Then we have the terrestrial food chain, food web. So we have a web here. We have grass, we have insects, we have the shrew, we have the mouse, the snake, the rabbit, the deer, and the cougar, right? So I want us to note that these organisms are necessary in that they are all a part of the web. And as we see the inter-eating going on here. So the grass is being ate by the deer, the rabbit, look at the arrows, the mouse, the insects, right? Where you see that the insects eat the grass and then the mouse eat the insects, but the mouse also eat the grass straight. So you see where it has multiple feeders, right? So we're gonna continue on this note. I'm gonna do a part 2. So look out for the part 2. I'm gonna put both of them in